You weren't born addicted to outrage, but your brain has been conditioned to crave it. They don't just want your clicks, they want your cortisol. When you stay mad, the algorithm gets smarter and your identity gets noisier. You weren't being served, you were being studied. You don't have to be rage posting to be stuck in the loop. Sometimes it's just a scroll that goes on for too long, a comment section you wish you hadn't opened, a clip that leaves a pit in your stomach and stays with you for hours. Here's what's very disturbing. You didn't choose to feel that way, but your brain, and more importantly your mind, was being conditioned to feel that way. One of the largest studies on emotional content sharing found that anger spreads faster than any other emotion online. Not because people enjoy being mad, but because anger triggers two systems at once. Your non-conscious mind, which fires up to restore the balance that the disruption has caused, and your physiology, your brain's reward pathway, lights up as it anticipates another emotionally charged interaction. And at the same time, your cortisol levels rise in preparation for threat. This combination is volatile, to say the least. The conscious mind is saying, fix the problem and restore balance. Dopamine says, more. Cortisol says, defend. The result? Your body feels really overactivated. And your thoughts start racing, and even if you're not yelling at a screen, your internal state becomes louder than you actually realize. But this isn't about a flaw in your brain. This is about how your conscious mind is rehearsing what it perceives as familiar. Every time you engage with content that makes you angry, your conscious mind interprets that reaction and begins building it into thought trees in your brain. And the more emotional energy you feed those trees, the more your brain adjusts to match that pattern because they're getting stronger. And the algorithms notice. They learn what activates you, what pulls you back, what keeps you spiraling, and they just keep serving more of it. Not because it's true, not because it's helpful, but because it's profitable. And by this point, your stress has switched into the toxic version and is generating, there's a problem, data. Bottom line, your engagement is actually feeding a system that monetizes dysregulation. And slowly, the rehearsed emotional chaos starts feeling like self-definition. Because your non-conscious stores this repetition as a habit. Don't get sucked in. This isn't about deleting your apps or pretending the world isn't on fire. It's about understanding the loops you get caught in and managing them. Reclaiming your mental space from patterns that never asked for your consent in the first place. In this week's episode, we're going to explore what your brain is actually doing when you scroll through emotional volatility, how your non-conscious mind stores those high-intensity patterns without your conscious awareness, how your non-conscious mind is trying to get your attention to self-regulate your reactions and not get sucked in, the exact loop that forms between dopamine, cortisol, and thought rehearsal, and what you can actually do to interrupt the outrage cycle before it becomes the incorrect default state of your inner life. A rehearsed mind doesn't mean you agree with the input. It just means your system hasn't had a chance to update. And that update starts with noticing what you've been practicing and choosing what you want to rewire. Let's begin. Actually, before we get started, I want to thank you for being here. Each time you pause, really pause, you shift what your mind stores as normal. And that act alone begins to reshape your internal patterns. Maybe you opened this episode out of curiosity. Maybe part of you already sensed something wasn't sitting right. Either way, your presence here matters. And if what I'm sharing resonates with you, I go so much deeper in my new book, Help in a Hurry. It's the guide I wish I had when my mind felt like it was running faster than my body could even begin to keep up with. And you can order it now. Let's continue today's episode. Sometimes the disruption is subtle. You open an app for one reason, but something shifts. Not dramatically, just enough that your focus narrows and your attention drifts into a space you feel drawn to. Your body notices first. Maybe it's a tightness, a buzz in your limbs, the sense that you're suddenly preparing for something without knowing what. Your mind begins to interpret that shift, and because your brain doesn't think, the brain reacts to the intensity of the message coming from the mind. And when the input is charged, when it carries emotional voltage, it gets flagged. That's when the rehearsal begins at a vigorous pace. not intentionally but neurologically. Your conscious mind slips into a messy state and starts amplifying the emotional state. And the more often this happens, the more that state gets stored. This isn't isolated to the moment you saw the post or the headline. It doesn't stay contained. It carries and spreads like a virus. You snap at a partner. You zone out during a conversation. You feel your inner pace accelerate even when the environment doesn't demand it. Why? Because emotional patterns, when repeated, become physiological defaults. This is psychoneurobiology in action. The mind, as the center of awareness and intention, detects the pattern, and if it does not listen to the warning signals from the unconscious, it accepts instead of questioning it. The brain, responding to what the mind rehearses, begins to reinforce it. And soon, reactivity feels familiar, even comforting. So it's not about addiction to conflict. It is about conscious rehearsal of urgency. When your mind continually processes emotionally loaded content, it tunes out of the wisdom of the unconscious, and those reactions become neural blueprints. And the distorted version of your response, instead of the wise version from the unconscious, begins to drive behavior automatically. You might feel overstimulated but mentally foggy, struggle to wind down without knowing why. Notice that calm feels untrustworthy, even uncomfortable, and that's imprinting and entrainment. And once you bring that imprint into awareness, you can begin to change it. Because your mind is not passive, it's a builder. And whatever it builds, your brain follows. Let's map what's happening beneath the surface. Outrage isn't just emotional, it has neurological impact. When you engage with something provocative, the dopamine system is activated. And dopamine doesn't reward pleasure, it amplifies focus. It sharpens your anticipation, primes your pursuit, and prepares you to stay locked in. That's why you don't just scroll, you chase. And if you don't listen to your intuition that is urging you to restore balance, you refresh, you dig, you comment, you escalate. And this just activates too much cortisol. Too much cortisol signals your body to prepare for conflict, for disruption, for defense. Not because you're in danger, but because the system has learned to respond as if you are. And when these two systems activate in sequence, your internal state becomes high alert. And if the cycle repeats, your baseline shifts. Now, even neutral moments feel charged. And now, quiet feels foreign. Now, pause feels suspicious. This is the disrupted dopamine-cortisol loop. It forms from exposure and not listening to intuitive sense to restore balance. And then you get stuck in rehearsal. Your conscious mind takes the emotionally charged experience and begins building a thought structure around it, one piece at a time, until it's not just an emotion, it's a pattern. Your brain responds to this by allocating resources, faster firing pathways, stronger connections, more reflexive responses. A feedback loop is set up between the messy conscious mind and brain, and that's what makes these patterns feel like personality. But they're not personality. They're architecture built under pressure. They disrupt your personality. And pressure-coded thoughts operate differently than those formed from clarity. But here's what matters. Your mind remains the builder. It's the agent, the architect, the activator. And that means even the most entrenched emotional responses can be reworked. Not by force, but by gentle, repeated redirection. By naming the loop and choosing not to rehearse it again. That's the first step. And in the next chapter, we're going to look directly at the behaviors and beliefs that reinforce these loops, so you can begin dismantling them with clarity and intent. Let's talk about the habits that feel harmless but silently shape how your mind stores emotional energy. You are reading headlines late at night because you want to stay informed. You watch debate clips to keep up with what people are saying. You follow threads that challenge your views, thinking you're expanding perspective. But what happens internally is often something else. The longer you linger in emotionally reactive spaces without being alert to your intuitive and unconscious mind, the more familiar they become. Your conscious mind will start to recognize emotional volatility as a kind of normal and wire this into the brain as a distorted network. And once something feels normal, it stops being questioned. Outrage is often mistakenly believed to be an active choice, but it's actually a passive habit ingrained in the non-conscious mind. Fortunately, a corresponding solution exists within the same mental framework. It's not about being furious. It's about becoming emotionally coded by repetition, because most of what gets stored in the non-conscious happens without fanfare. And the reinforcement doesn't require intense drama, just frequency, a low-grade pull towards tension, a subtle craving for stimulation, a learned resistance to stillness. You may think, I need to see how this ends. If I don't keep up, I'm uninformed. This is how I stay sharp. But if you could pause the mental momentum and track what's actually happening in your inner world, you might find something quite different. Your breath is shallow, your shoulders are tense, your emotional tone is wired for urgency, and your intuitive, non-conscious mind is sending multiple signals to shift. These aren't signs of awareness, they're signs of pattern fatigue. And over time, this fatigue gets misread as personality. Short-tempered, always alert, easily distracted. What's really happening beneath the surface is a slow drift into emotional rehearsal that merged your brain with these environments. And that's the stuck point. When something practiced begins to feel personal, your conscious mind builds what it repeatedly engages. If it doesn't reason intuitively, it ignores essential advice that builds disruptive and not insightful habit loops. And your brain follows suit, rewiring towards whatever gets reinforced. And this is why clarity doesn't come from more input. It comes from recognizing how certain kinds of input are shaping your inner atmosphere. And once you name that shaping, you can start to question the environments you've been treating as neutral, because many of them are not neutral at all. They are curated to keep you activated, not informed, not aware, just reactive enough to stay engaged. This is the slow coding of your attention. And when left unchecked, it creates mental loops that turn emotional rehearsals into default operating modes. This isn't failure. It's conditioning that's been repeated. And now that you know this, you get to choose again. The moments when you feel most reactive are not necessarily the moments when you're seeing most clearly. They might feel sharp, they might feel urgent, but urgency is not the same as wisdom. Outrage can feel productive because it gives the illusion of momentum. But what it often builds is an emotional residue that settles deeper each time it goes unexamined. So here's the shift. Start asking not just, what am I reacting to? But, what am I rehearsing and why? Because if your mind is constantly constructing thought patterns in response to emotional stimuli, then you're not just reacting, you're building. And once you realize that building is happening at the level of your non-conscious, you begin to understand the power of even the smallest shift. One moment of choosing to pause. One moment of letting a post pass without engaging. One moment of noticing how an interaction leaves your body feeling afterwards. These are not minor acts. They are the beginning of rebalancing your internal cues. And when your cues shift, your choices shift. And when your choices shift, your thought trees begin to shift. And that process, the active redirection of energy, is how reconceptualization begins. You don't have to dismantle outrage by force. You can interrupt it with awareness. Then you can embrace process and reconceptualize it. And your brain, given the new pattern, will begin to respond differently. Because what gets built is not just shaped by how you react, it's shaped by how often you choose to notice what you are reinforcing. This is where change begins. Not in what you believe, but in how you engage. Reframe isn't about switching thoughts. It's about shifting how you are listening to your intuition and analyzing what your mind is using to build networks into your brain. Very different. That's where the power lives. That's where healing starts. And that's how you take back authorship of your inner patterns. This tool isn't about avoiding emotion. It's about shifting the environment your mind uses to build. When you feel that flicker of tension while scrolling, or even long after you've closed the app, you can begin interrupting the pattern with one intentional cycle. This tool draws directly from the 5-step Neurocycle, condensed for speed and simplicity without losing depth. It can be done in 3 minutes, no matter where you are. Step 1. Tune in. awareness. Notice what's active right now, not in the content, but in your body. Is your jaw clenched? Are your eyes darting all over the place? Is your breathing shallow? This isn't self-monitoring, it's sensory noticing. Step 2, name the shift. Reflect. Ask, what did I just take in that changed my internal state? Was it a headline, a facial expression, an unfinished thought? The goal isn't to psychoanalyze, just to notice the cause-effect moment. Step 3, externalize. Write. If possible, jot down a word or phrase that captures what activated you. If you can't write in that moment, just speak it quietly to yourself. This offloads some of the neural energy tied to the thought trees. It helps your mind begin the separation between reaction and reflection. Step 4, recenter, recheck. Ask yourself, is this thought pattern helping me respond or just helping me rehearse? This is the critical turning point. It teaches your brain that not every activation deserves additional rehearsal. 5, redirect, active reach. Replace the internal chaos with something deliberate. 3 long exhales. Looking up and describing the colors around you. Repeating a phrase like, I'm allowed to reset. This teaches your brain a new exit point from the loop. Over time, the repetition of this practice becomes part of how your mind self-regulates. You're not erasing emotion, you're just rerouting energy. And each time you do, your brain takes note, rewiring slowly, steadily, and under the direction of your conscious mind. You didn't imagine it. That jumpy feeling after watching a comment war, the lingering tightness after reading a thread that made you feel unseen, the sudden spike of energy when a reel lines up perfectly with what you're mad about. Those aren't just emotions. They are neural rehearsals. What we call platforms are environments, and environments shape brains. Every interaction trains something because your brain is plastic, and your conscious, messy part of your mind that engages is adaptive. It can easily get sucked into the sensations from your nervous system and not listen to your intuitive non-conscious mind. There's a term in systems theory, a closed feedback loop. It means that the output of a system becomes the input for the next round. Social media outrage works exactly this way. You react, the platform notices, it shows you more, you react again. And now the reaction is driving the input. Here's what that looks like in real time. You pause to rewatch a tense clip. You hover on a toxic thread. You read a comment 5 times, trying to decode its meaning. Your messy conscious mind gets sucked into your nervous system. None of those acts are inherently harmful unless the messy part of the conscious mind starts ignoring the warning signals. Repeated frequently, these become feedback signals. Your non-conscious stores them not as isolated actions, but as part of an emerging thought tree with problems and solutions built in. And your brain, responding to what your conscious messy mind chooses to engage with, the problems or the solutions, begins streamlining those responses. This means faster activation, sharper emotional edges, narrower attention, and this means that your system is responding accurately to the pattern it's being fed. And here's where the mirror matters. Platforms are optimized to serve what keeps you engaged, not what keeps you well. They don't show you what helps your mind self-regulate, they show you what your past behavior says you're likely to click. And that's not personalization, that's algorithmic rehearsal. So what looks like a pattern of interest might be a pattern of inflammation. And what feels like momentum might just be repetition without reflection. This is not a moral critique of technology. It's a reminder that no environment is neutral and that you always need to think deeply and engage with intuition. When you scroll, your brain is adjusting and merging with the environment it is immersed in. When you pause, however, and notice, your mind regains authorship. And in that moment of noticing, you re-enter the loop as an active participant, not just as a consumer of emotional noise. That shift isn't abstract, it's physiological, and it's where transformation starts. Oh, I like that. Let's be honest. The algorithm doesn't need you to understand, it needs you to react. It's not watching for accuracy, it's tracking for volatility. And every time you respond from that inner spike, whether a like, a repost, or even a silent scroll, the system takes that input as permission. But your mind was not built for someone else's code. Your mind was built to choose, to direct, to build new thoughts, to interrupt old rehearsals. And every time you re-engage without noticing what it's doing to your inner world, you forfeit authorship. You let your attention be hijacked by a loop that's profitable to someone else and familiar to your own wiring. That combination, familiar and profitable, is dangerous because it means the system benefits while you repeat. But here's the shift. You can stop feeding the loop. You can recognize the spike. You can catch the micro moment before the scroll. And in that space, your mind reclaims its voice. Mental direction doesn't require performance. It begins when you stop repeating chaos. Logging off isn't the fix, but re-entering with intention starts the shift. One breath, one redirection. Outrage isn't the problem. Unexamined rehearsal is. You live in a world that rewards your reactivity, bottom line, that curates your anger, that conditions your attention to seek what destabilizes you just enough to keep you plugged in. But your nervous system was not built to live inside a loop of provocation. It was built to adapt, yes, but also to reset. And that reset begins when your mind starts noticing what it's been practicing. Because every interaction isn't just a reaction, it's an input. And every input is training something. You might not remember the last 20 things you scrolled past, but your unconscious does. And it's not just storing facts or opinions, it's storing emotional posture and how not to react. This is the part no one likes to talk about. Your nervous system is being trained how to respond disruptively if you don't listen to your unconscious. How to expect, how to brace. So when you find yourself tired for no reason, edgy when nothing external is pushing you, or oddly activated by something minor, that is not random. That is residue. And residue compounds. It shapes the mood you wake up in, the thoughts you trust, the version of yourself that feels most familiar. But you are not your rehearsal patterns. You are the one with the power to rebuild them. And that begins not with a radical decision, but with a subtle noticing. A 5-second breath, a 3-word journal note, a 2-minute delay before re-entering the feed. These aren't trivial acts. They are rewiring tools, because what your mind practices, your brain will follow. And what your brain repeats, your identity can start to absorb. So let this episode be a moment of interruption. Not just in your scroll, but in your self-permission. You are allowed to stop mid-loop. You are allowed to question the input. You are allowed to choose not to rehearse what you never agreed to encode. Outrage will always be loud, but you don't need to match the noise. You just need to stay steady. It just has to become more consistent. And consistency doesn't begin with willpower, it begins with recognition. Your mind is already building something. Let it be something you choose. If this episode resonated with you, don't just move on. Let it mark the start of a quieter internal pattern, one that builds strength through reflection, not reactivity. If you want to go deep into how to interrupt mental overload and train your thought life with intention, I wrote Help in a Hurry for you. It's the exact guide I wish I had when emotional chaos felt like the norm. And it's out now. You can get it wherever books are sold. Let this be the start of choosing what gets reinforced. What you rehearse is what takes root.